I think my mother did exactly the right thing. I think it's absolutely extraordinary.
Nobody in the room expected Princess Anne to be the one who finally broke protocol. Yet with senior royal staff seated around the table and King Charles watching in stunned silence, Anne placed a private letter attributed to Camilla directly before them. Then came the words that changed the atmosphere completely. Enough was enough. This was no private disagreement anymore. Anne had deliberately brought the conflict into a room where it could no longer be quietly buried. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles knew immediately this was no ordinary family dispute. The closed meeting at Buckingham Palace followed weeks of tension over how royal households were being managed. And a royal household simply means the staff and officials supporting a senior family member's public duties. William sat nearby, watching his aunt with concern, while Camilla remained unnervingly still, aware that the meeting had shifted from routine administration into a direct challenge to her judgment and her private influence. Anne did not raise her voice. She unfolded the letter, identified it as private correspondence from the Queen Consort, and read selected passages aloud. Her accusation was direct. The wording, she said, showed an attempt to pressure senior staff into reducing other family members' influence over important duties and future decisions. Camilla's face changed at once. Something she believed would remain private had reached the one person least likely to ignore it. Charles looked from his sister to his wife and said nothing. That silence hardened Anne rather than calming her. She told the king that if everyone knew such pressure was being applied and stayed quiet, silence itself became approval. Camilla finally challenged her, insisting private advice was being twisted into something darker. Anne simply read one paragraph about restructuring royal responsibilities, then folded the page shut. William noticed something else. One senior aide at the end of the table would not look at Camilla. The prince watched him carefully, realizing the letter might have circulated before reaching Anne. If parts of the message had already passed among staff, this was no longer only about what Camilla intended. It was about what others believed they had been told to do. Anne slowly placed the letter beside Charles's briefing folder and removed her glasses. "You need to read what comes next," she said. The monarch reached for the page, but before opening it, he fixed his sister with a question that stopped everyone cold. "Where did you get this?" Suddenly, who passed Anne the letter seemed almost secondary to whose future Camilla appeared to be discussing inside it. The letter mattered because this was never simply a battle over desks, schedules, or palace influence. Behind every formal title stood a family carrying decades of unfinished history. Anne had spent years protecting the monarchy through discipline rather than spectacle. Camilla had spent years establishing her own place beside Charles. William was preparing for the future, and Charles suddenly faced the possibility that the people closest to him had very different ideas about what that future should look like. Anne felt the weight of what she had done, but she did not regret bringing the letter into the open. Her loyalty had always been built around duty, continuity, and restraint. That made her decision to expose private correspondence even more serious. A royal household, the staff, advisors, and officials who organize a senior royal's public work depends on trust. Once that trust becomes mixed with private influence, small decisions can quietly shape who is seen, who is heard, and who is pushed aside. Camilla saw the situation very differently. She had spent years building her position beside the king, facing pressure from public expectation, competing schedules, patronages, staffing decisions, and the constant demands placed on Charles. To her, the letter was private advice, written during a period of growing strain. Anne's choice to read it before senior officials felt less like accountability and more like humiliation. The Queen Consort believed she should have been confronted privately first, and that sense of betrayal sharpened every glance between them. William remained silent, but his concern deepened when Anne admitted that the letter contained language connected to the Wales household. The prince immediately asked what had been written. She refused to answer. Charles had not yet read the entire document, and Anne insisted that her brother must see it before anyone else reacted. William understood the logic. Yet the future king also knew that any attempt to reduce his household's influence would touch Catherine, their staff, and the public duties they were preparing to carry for years. Charles finally moved toward Camilla when the others fell quiet. He asked one question in a low voice. Had she written every paragraph herself? The monarch was not accusing her. He was searching for certainty. Camilla began to answer, stopped halfway through, and turned toward Anne instead. That hesitation lasted only seconds, but everyone who noticed it understood the implication. Perhaps the letter carried more than one person's thinking. Anne then delivered the detail that changed the entire timeline. The letter, she said, had not started the crisis. It had confirmed something she already feared. Weeks earlier, one specific conversation had convinced her that decisions involving royal duties were being discussed before the people affected even knew about them. And to understand why Anne finally decided silence was no longer acceptable, everything had to return to that earlier evening, the quiet Windsor dinner, where one seemingly harmless proposal became the point of no return. Every family confrontation has an earlier moment that only looks important afterward. In this fictional royal drama, that moment came during a private Windsor dinner several weeks before Anne exposed the letter. Nothing shattered. Nobody shouted. Yet one sentence concerning future royal duties caused Anne to put down her glass and study Camilla across the table. From that moment onward, she began watching more carefully, and what she later discovered convinced her the dinner had been a warning. Camilla introduced the idea carefully, almost as if it were nothing more than a practical adjustment. Several prominent engagements traditionally handled within Anne's sphere, she suggested, could be reassigned through a more centralized household structure. That meant bringing decisions about schedules, appearances, and responsibilities under a smaller coordinating group, rather than leaving each senior royals team to manage them separately. Charles heard efficiency. William heard something else. The prince understood that changing who controlled an engagement also changed who gained public visibility, access to the king, and influence inside the family. Anne did not react immediately. She waited, listened, then placed her glass down before dessert and asked, "Who exactly decided this?" Charles looked toward Camilla, expecting a simple answer. The queen consort replied that nobody had formally decided anything, that it was only a suggestion meant to reduce pressure on the monarch. Anne asked whether anyone had consulted her before discussing the duties she had carried for years. The answer came slowly enough to trouble her. She was no longer irritated. She was suspicious. Camilla insisted the proposal was practical, not personal. Anne's response was colder. Loyalty, she said, could not survive if decisions were made around people rather than with them. William stayed quiet, but he noticed Charles trying to soften the moment, treating the exchange as a misunderstanding that would pass. The future king sensed it would not. Anne had already begun measuring every word against something larger. 2 days later, that feeling hardened into evidence. Anne received an internal scheduling note through a documented staff communication, and the wording was almost identical to phrases used at the Windsor dinner. The note referred to consolidating responsibilities and limiting overlapping representation. For her, that similarity mattered because it suggested the conversation had not been casual at all. Someone had already translated the idea into administrative language. Weeks later, the private letter reached Anne through a trusted staff channel. Its language connected those earlier phrases to a broader plan affecting access, duties, and household influence. That was when her suspicion became resolve. If staff had already been pulled into the process, she believed the truth could not be handled through another quiet family conversation. Anne made her decision without drama. The next time she faced Camilla, she would not arrive with questions. She would arrive with the letter and force everyone who had touched the issue to hear exactly what it contained. The first passage had shocked the room. The final paragraph nearly broke it apart. Anne unfolded the letter again, while Camilla watched from only a few feet away. Charles told his sister to be careful. Anne answered that careful silence was precisely how the situation had reached this point. Then she read the words she believed changed everything, language suggesting that certain royal voices should be kept outside future strategic discussions. William immediately understood that this confrontation was no longer about scheduling. Anne let the words hang before asking Camilla the question nobody else seemed willing to ask. Did she intend to exclude senior members of the family from decisions affecting their own duties? Camilla's expression hardened. The Queen Consort argued that Anne was turning administrative language into a personal attack. A strategic discussion, in this context, meant an internal planning conversation about future royal work, priorities, and responsibilities. To Camilla, narrowing that circle was about efficiency. To Anne, it looked like control. Charles tried to interrupt before the argument became impossible to contain. Anne turned toward him immediately. She told the king that this was exactly why she had brought the letter into the open. Everyone had been speaking around the truth, she said, while staff were left to guess which private suggestions carried real authority. William stayed silent, but the prince's tension was obvious. If the same language touched the Wales household, then the future king could not dismiss it as someone else's dispute. Camilla finally pushed her chair back and stood. She admitted writing the letter, but insisted it had been a private strategic note, never an order, and never intended to become formal policy. Anne did not move. She asked why. Then, the same recommendations had begun appearing in working proposals. For a moment, nobody answered. One senior staff member finally broke the silence. He confirmed through the documented meeting record that parts of the letter's wording had already appeared in draft proposals circulating between offices. That admission changed everything. Camilla's anger gave way to humiliation, because the officials around her were no longer simply watching a family fight. They were being asked to verify whether her private words had already shaped palace decisions. Charles placed one hand flat against the table and ordered everyone to stop talking. The monarch's voice was controlled, but the decision was immediate. Every memorandum, email summary, staffing proposal, and scheduling note connected to the restructuring would be gathered for review. No assumption would be accepted. No explanation would be taken on trust. The letter had opened the wound. Now the paperwork would decide how deep it went, and Charles's next move would determine who truly held authority inside the palace. Charles had remained caught between two people he trusted for very different reasons. That ended when the paperwork arrived. One folder after another showed how suggestions moved from private conversation into administrative language, sometimes subtly, sometimes almost word for word. The king now faced an uncomfortable choice: defend intention or judge consequences. His answer stunned the room. Until every decision had been reviewed, the disputed restructuring would stop immediately. Charles read each document more slowly than the last. Inside a royal household, private advice can become powerful when secretaries turn preferences into schedules, briefing papers, staffing proposals, and access decisions. That mattered because staff often acted on what they believed reflected the monarch's wishes, even when no formal order had been given. The king could now see the danger clearly. A suggestion from Camilla did not need to be signed by him to carry weight if officials assumed she spoke with his backing. Camilla reacted immediately. She told Charles that freezing the proposals would make her look guilty before anyone had even judged her intentions. The Queen Consort insisted she had been trying to reduce confusion, not create a private chain of command. Anne answered with equal control. She told her brother that accountability was not humiliation, and that protecting the crown sometimes required disappointing someone he loved. Charles did not respond at once. He knew she was asking him to separate marriage from duty, and that was precisely what made the decision painful. Then the paperwork delivered something worse. Charles discovered that one proposal affecting Anne's engagements had been drafted before the Windsor dinner. The king read the date twice. If the draft existed earlier, then Camilla's comments that evening could not easily be dismissed as a spontaneous suggestion. Anne said nothing, but her silence carried its own weight. What she had feared was beginning to look structured. William found another reference buried in the same chain. The prince saw the Wales household named in a planning note discussing future coordination and access. That widened the crisis instantly. This was no longer only about Anne's work. The future king understood that decisions affecting his own team had also been discussed inside the same system, and he looked toward Charles for a response. Charles finally closed the thick folder, removed his glasses, and turned to his private secretary. "Nothing moves until I understand who authorized what." The monarch ordered an immediate separation between personal recommendations and official instructions. No private preference would be treated as royal authority without direct confirmation. Camilla heard exactly what that meant. Charles had chosen institutional caution over instinctive protection, and she would be the first person to feel the consequences. By morning, that decision would no longer exist only on paper. Camilla would walk into a palace, operating very differently around her. The fallout did not arrive through shouting, it arrived through silence. The following morning, Camilla entered what she expected to be a routine briefing, and discovered that several decisions had been removed from the agenda, pending Charles's review. Nobody accused her, nobody needed to. The empty spaces told the story. For the first time since Anne exposed the letter, Camilla understood that the crisis had changed something fundamental. Assumptions about her authority were being rewritten in real time. Camilla read the revised agenda twice, before asking what had changed. Charles's temporary directive now separated her personal household recommendations from decisions involving other senior royals. A directive, in simple terms, was an instruction setting out how palace staff were expected to act. From that morning onward, officials had to confirm sensitive decisions directly through the king's office, instead of assuming that an informal preference carried royal approval. The queen consort understood the logic. What hurt was what the change seemed to say about trust. Camilla finally asked one secretary the question she had been avoiding. Did people now believe she had deliberately tried to isolate Anne? The answer was careful, but the hesitation wounded her more than a direct accusation might have. She had wanted order. Now she feared everyone saw ambition instead. When the briefing ended, the queen consort remained seated for several seconds, folded the unused agenda closed, and placed it quietly beside her. Anne felt no satisfaction when she heard how sharply the new rules had landed. She had forced the issue into the open, but she understood that accountability carried a human cost. The princess knew humiliation inside a family could survive long after any administrative dispute was settled. She had wanted boundaries, not destruction. Yet the colder the palace became around Camilla, the more Anne began to wonder whether exposing the letter had created wounds that rules alone could never repair. Then another development unsettled Camilla. Charles had requested a private meeting with William before speaking with her again. She feared the prince had fully sided with Anne and that the king was preparing an even harsher response. Instead, William surprised his father. He told Charles he did not want punishment. The future king wanted clear boundaries, so private advice could never again become unofficial policy simply because staff assumed it carried authority. Charles listened carefully. The monarch understood that William was offering a way forward without turning the crisis into revenge. Camilla would remain beside him, Anne would keep her duties, and the system would change. But one problem remained untouched. The palace machinery could be repaired with rules. The family fracture could only be addressed face to face, and that meant Anne and Camilla would finally have to speak without staff, advisors, or Charles between them. There were no secretaries in the room, no king, no future monarch, no notes being taken. For the first time since the letter emerged, Anne and Camilla sat opposite one another without the protection of titles or staff. The confrontation everyone expected never came. Instead, Anne asked one deceptively simple question. Why had Camilla felt the need to put those thoughts in writing at all? The answer transformed the meaning of their conflict. Anne had requested the meeting herself because she refused to let palace procedure become a substitute for dealing with the personal damage between them. Camilla agreed, but only on one condition. Neither woman would quote Charles or use his authority to strengthen her own position. That mattered because the dispute had already been shaped by royal hierarchy, meaning the formal order of influence and responsibility inside the family. For once, they would speak simply as two people dealing with the consequences of what had happened. Camilla answered slowly. She admitted that she had become increasingly anxious about the royal households pulling in different directions, with separate teams competing for time, appearances, and access to the king. The queen consort believed greater central control would protect Charles from being overwhelmed. Anne listened without interrupting, but her response was firm. Fear might explain the letter, she said, but it could not justify excluding people who had devoted decades to royal duty. Camilla finally conceded the point she had resisted from the beginning. Her wording had gone too far. She had underestimated how quickly private recommendations could be treated by staff as instructions, especially when those words came from the monarch's wife. The admission did not erase the damage, but it changed the tone. Anne's anger softened because, for the first time, she heard recognition rather than defense. Anne then made her own admission. She had deliberately exposed the letter in front of senior staff. The princess knew a private confrontation would not have been enough, because the disputed ideas had already entered scheduling notes and working proposals. If officials had helped carry those ideas forward, she believed those same people needed to hear the correction directly. Camilla did not like the answer, but she understood its logic. Camilla reached toward the original letter resting between them, then stopped. Anne slid it toward her instead of pulling it away. There was no apology exchanged in that moment, and no sudden forgiveness, but the gesture broke something that had been hardening between them. Anne offered one path forward. She would support a settlement if Camilla acknowledged the mistake directly to those who had witnessed the exposure. The queen consort agreed. Their private conversation had changed the emotional temperature inside the palace, but beyond those walls, the confrontation was about to become something far larger. By the next morning, the private family conflict had become a national story. The fictional front page that captured the mood used only 4 words across its banner. Anne draws the line. Outside Buckingham Palace, cameras gathered before sunrise as broadcasters debated whether the confrontation represented royal dysfunction or something more unusual, an internal correction happening in full view. Yet the image that stayed with the public was not of anger. It was Anne leaving quietly, expression composed, refusing to celebrate. Anne felt deeply uncomfortable as the story spread. Commentators were already dividing into camps, with some accusing her of humiliating Camilla, and others praising her for defending clear boundaries inside the monarchy. Palace communications, the official statements and briefings used to explain royal decisions to the public, carefully avoided releasing the private letter itself. Instead, officials confirmed that internal working arrangements had been reviewed and clarified. That choice mattered because the palace was trying to correct the system without turning private correspondence into public evidence. Camilla absorbed the coverage far more painfully. The queen consort knew that a few lines she regretted had now become shorthand for her motives, her influence, and even her character. A private mistake had become a national symbol. At the Buckingham Palace gates, one broadcaster held up the fictional "Anne draws the line" front page, while a small crowd behind the barriers watched the live report in silence. The moment captured the strange balance of fascination and discomfort surrounding the crisis. Charles refused to let public pressure dictate the punishment. The king rejected demands for a dramatic removal of duties, and instead approved a written protocol governing how recommendations from every royal household would become official instructions. A protocol, in plain terms, was a formal set of rules designed to prevent private suggestions from being mistaken for royal commands. The monarch believed the lesson had to survive long after the headlines disappeared. Anne made no victory statement. She declined to frame the outcome as a personal triumph over Camilla, because that had never been her aim. The princess had wanted to stop blurred authority from hardening into permanent practice. She understood that defeating one family member publicly would solve nothing if the institution itself remained vulnerable to the same confusion. Camilla also remained silent, but not for long. Charles had arranged one final gathering with the same senior staff who had witnessed the original confrontation. This time, the Queen Consort would not be defending the letter. She would be addressing what it had caused. The first meeting had begun with an accusation. The last would determine whether the monarchy emerged fractured or corrected. The second gathering looked almost identical to the first, but everything beneath the surface had changed. The same table, many of the same people, yet this time Anne carried no letter. Camilla did. She placed it before her, acknowledged that private advice had crossed into territory where others could reasonably interpret it as authority, and accepted the new boundaries Charles had imposed. There was no dramatic embrace afterward. What followed was quieter, and ultimately far more important. Charles spoke first, because the final decision rested with him. The king formally introduced a new protocol, meaning a clear set of rules governing how royal households communicate and act. From that moment forward, any decision affecting another senior royal's duties would require direct consultation and explicit approval. No secretary would be expected to guess whether a private suggestion carried official authority. The disputed restructuring plan was abandoned completely, and the existing responsibilities of Anne and the Wales household remained untouched. Camilla then addressed the same senior staff who had witnessed the original confrontation. The Queen Consort admitted that the wording of her private letter had allowed personal concern to sound like an instruction to sideline others. She did not claim the damage had been imagined. She accepted that her words carried greater weight because of her position beside Charles, and that she had failed to consider how quickly staff might act on them. Anne listened without triumph. When her turn came, the princess said the confrontation had been painful because loyalty was not always gentle. Sometimes loyalty meant saying the one thing a family desperately wanted left unsaid. She made clear that she had never wanted Camilla removed or humiliated. She wanted a boundary restored before private influence became accepted practice. Charles ended any remaining uncertainty. Camilla would remain beside him and retain her established role, but no household, including hers, would exercise authority over another through assumption. The monarch's decision protected both marriage and institution by refusing to sacrifice one for the other. Anne then picked up the original letter one final time. She walked across the room and placed it directly into Camilla's hand. The Queen Consort folded it once and put it away. Charles watched without speaking. That small exchange ended the personal contest more clearly than any punishment could have done. Anne left relieved rather than victorious. Camilla left chastened rather than destroyed. Charles remained behind, knowing his family had chosen restraint over retaliation. The crisis had not produced a winner. It had produced a limit. And that became the final meaning of Anne's "enough is enough" moment. Service to the crown sometimes requires confronting those closest to it, while acknowledgement can stop a serious mistake from becoming a permanent fracture. The monarchy survived not because everyone agreed, but because the line between private influence and public duty was finally restored. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.